My wife cheated on me with my partner, but she has no idea that I know her secret. Martin accidentally saw Bella with his business partner, and that moment changed everything. She has no clue that her husband knows about her affair and is planning his revenge. At a corporate event filled with intrigue and tension, Martin decides to expose her in front of everyone. But by the end of the night, he's faced with an unexpected truth that forces him to make a tough choice: to forgive or leave forever. Will he find a path to peace? You'll be surprised by his decision. Martin stood in the dark hallway, staring at the shattered remains of a phone. It was her phone, Bella's phone. All his suspicions were now confirmed. But what to do next? He didn't know how to act. Seconds stretched into infinity as silence filled the air, broken only by the faint echo of his footsteps in the empty apartment. He knew this moment would change everything, but he wasn't prepared for the storm of emotions that would come after uncovering the truth. The phone in his hand was cold to the touch, but it carried a faint trace of her perfume. It was the last thing connecting him to the life that had just fallen apart. But Martin wasn't ready to give up. He placed the phone back on the table and slowly walked to the kitchen. Bella was supposedly at an event. He couldn't tell for sure if she was actually working or if she'd spun yet another romantic escapade. She always found time for other men. Sometimes, her absence was the only way he could feel her presence. After hours of unbearable silence in the apartment, Martin decided to act. He collected himself. It was a significant decision, but he had no choice. He was organizing a forum, a large, high-profile business event. Every detail had been meticulously planned. Top executives, colleagues, and invited partners would attend. Bella, as always, had said she couldn't miss such an occasion. Martin decided to use that to his advantage. His plan was simple: find the truth. If Bella wasn't involved in any of this, why had her emotions been so volatile? Why did she constantly hide messages on her phone, make vague excuses for her absences, and surround herself with secrecy? He drove to the forum with a storm raging inside him. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter, but Martin couldn't focus. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for her. And then, among the guests, he spotted Bella. She stood with a group of men, speaking animatedly, her eyes sparkling. As always, her natural flirtation seemed effortless and casual. But today, it had an entirely different meaning. Martin felt his chest tighten as he watched her. He didn't have all the evidence yet, but this didn't look like someone preoccupied with anything other than her own enjoyment. An hour later, as the forum reached its peak, Martin received a text from a colleague that shattered the illusion. It was a single phrase he couldn't ignore. "She's with him again?" With whom? Martin thought, though his heart already knew the answer. He rose from his seat and moved toward where Bella stood. That's when he saw it. Her hands rested on the shoulders of one of the men, and her laughter rang out so loudly that anyone nearby could hear her excitement. It was Tom, his business partner. Martin couldn't watch any longer. His heart pounded furiously, but he kept his emotions in check. He returned to his seat, tilted his head back, and tried to process the situation. Was this encounter coincidental? Or was it part of what had been happening behind his back? Everything began spiraling out of control, and he could no longer pretend this was all just a misunderstanding. Toward the end of the evening, Martin approached Bella. She noticed his gaze immediately and froze. Her expression spoke volumes without her saying a word. "You couldn't help yourself, could you?" she said softly, her tone laced with a strange mix of guilt and defiance. "I know what you've done, Bella," Martin replied, his voice calm but laced with an undertone of pain. She shrugged, not even attempting to justify herself. "It's not what you think, Martin. It's just things happen. Sometimes it's hard, and you wouldn't understand. There's no other way to see this, Bella. I saw your eyes. I saw your hands on him. You betrayed me." The room seemed to grow silent, the weight of his words pressing down on both of them. Bella hesitated for a moment, then finally spoke, her voice void of emotion. "I don't love you, Martin. I don't know when it happened, but I can't do this anymore." Martin felt his world crumbling inside. What now? How would it all end? Slowly, he stood and said, "You took my heart, but I won't let you take my dignity." Martin left the room, feeling his life change forever. But what would his next step be? Outside, the night air was cool, and the city lights flickered in the darkness. Martin stood firm in his decision not to give in, yet an ache lingered within him even after he'd put an end to their relationship. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the unbridgeable distance that had grown between them. He wandered the streets for a while, trying to clear his head, and eventually sat on a park bench. The soft chime of his phone snapped him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Bella. "Martin, I'm waiting for you at home. Let's talk, please." He didn't know what to expect from this meeting, but deep down, he felt it was unavoidable. He returned home. When Martin entered the apartment, Bella was sitting on the couch, her face soft and calm. She was no longer the woman who turned heads at events, no longer the one who played games with other men. There was a vulnerability in her expression, a certain weakness. But Martin knew it was just a facade. She was still trying to hold on to him. "I don't know what you want to say, Bella," he said, keeping his gaze fixed on her face. "But I won't stay silent anymore." She sighed heavily and walked toward him, her voice slightly hoarse. "Martin, you don't understand. I didn't want this. I never wanted to hurt you. Maybe it was just my way of escaping reality, of dealing with how hard it's been for me to open up. I've always been weak." There was genuine remorse in her voice, but Martin couldn't accept it. He was struggling to remain calm, but his emotions were threatening to overflow. "This isn't just weakness, Bella. This is irresponsibility. It's a deliberate choice to turn to others while I was trying to be with you. You betrayed me, and I can't tolerate that." She lowered her head and went silent for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "I know, and I understand that I can't just ask for forgiveness because it won't change anything. But I'm willing to change. I'm willing to fight for us." She stepped closer and took his hand, but he pulled away, refusing to feel her touch any longer. "You want to fight? Then why didn't you do it earlier? Why did I have to find out like this? You chose to keep me in the dark while you played your games." Bella seemed to break down, her eyes filling with tears. "I was lazy. I was scared. Scared that I couldn't give you what you wanted. And so I sought substitutes in other men, in their attention." Martin turned away from her and walked to the window. He looked out at the glowing night city, but it brought him no comfort, no solace. He felt everything they had slipping through his fingers like sand. "Martin, please don't go," she said from behind him. Her voice was gentle but filled with urgency. "You can't just forget about us. We had so many good moments together." He turned back and looked at her. "But what did you do with those moments? How could you so easily throw me away? What do I even mean to you?" There was disappointment in her eyes, but he saw something else as well, fear. She was afraid of losing him forever. "I don't know why it happened," she replied softly, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to change. I want to earn back your trust." "I don't know if that's even possible," Martin said quietly. "And even if it is, I don't know if I want that anymore." Martin took a step toward the door, his heart heavy with pain and sadness. He wanted to leave her, but deep inside, he knew it wouldn't be an easy step. His thoughts were tangled, and the future seemed suspended in uncertainty. As he opened the door, Bella began to cry. "Martin, you can't leave it like this. You can't just walk away." Martin didn't reply. He walked out, leaving her behind. In the darkness of the night, he realized his life had changed again. Now, he had to face the journey alone. But what would come next? How would he react when he crossed paths with her again? And would he ever be ready to trust her once more? Those questions remained unanswered. Martin sat in a cafe, trying to calm his restless heart. His hands still gripped the coffee cup, but he couldn't feel its warmth. All his thoughts revolved around Bella and what had happened between them. How had he not noticed it for so long? How could she betray his trust so deeply? Suddenly, his phone rang. It was Bella. For a moment, Martin questioned whether he should answer, but his hand pressed the button to accept the call almost on its own. "Martin, we need to talk." Her voice was quiet but determined. "About what, Bella?" he replied, trying to control his tone. "It's important," she said. "I've learned something about your organization. Martin, you need to be careful." Martin held his breath. There was something in her voice that made him stop and think. She knew more than he expected. "What are you talking about?" he asked, already on edge. I found out that your colleague Richard, he's not who he seems to be. Her words came sharply through the line. And he has some interests connected to your recent projects. It's all very complicated, but you need to be careful. Are you saying that he's a traitor? Martin was stunned. Richard, his longtime friend and partner, had never seemed like that. It was unbelievable. I can't say more right now, but you need to stay vigilant. Richard has some connections with a company working with your organization. You need to dig deeper before it's too late. Where did you find this out? Martin couldn't believe what he was hearing. It doesn't matter, Martin, she replied quickly. You just have to be ready for things to spiral out of control. Martin ended the call and stared into the void, his mind heavy with thoughts. This was more than just Bella's betrayal. She was trying to warn him about something serious, and it made him question his decisions. But could he trust her after everything that had happened? He decided to act. That evening, he met with Richard, trying not to show any signs of suspicion. Richard, I've heard something interesting about you, Martin began, doing his best to remain calm. Richard looked at him with surprise but quickly smiled, a hint of tension lingering in his eyes. Oh, really? And what have you heard? He replied with a carefree grin that didn't match the unease Martin felt in the air. I've heard you have some interests tied to my latest project, Martin said, growing more doubtful about whether he could uncover the truth if Richard tried to deny everything. Richard paused briefly but then laughed. Martin, you're always so serious. We all have our connections and interests, but that doesn't mean they should concern you. You know how business works, right? Martin chose not to press further, though a growing sense of dread settled in his heart. What if Bella was right? What if Richard truly was betraying him? The next day, Martin gathered his team to investigate all the data on Richard and the company he was dealing with. His gut told him something was off, and he couldn't afford to wait any longer. That evening, after hours of searching, he stumbled upon some startling information. Richard did, in fact, have business ties with competitors vying against their project, and it seemed he was even prepared to hand over critical data in exchange for profits. The discovery was a shock to Martin. He stood frozen in front of the computer, staring at the screen, unsure of what to do next. This was betrayal, but on a scale far greater than he'd imagined. What shocked him even more was that Bella had known about it. She was aware of Richard's actions before Martin had even begun to suspect anything. That evening, he returned home. Bella was there, sitting on the couch, her face showing neither the usual regret nor worry. She just sat there, as though nothing had happened. Bella, he began, not looking at her. You knew about Richard. She looked at him in surprise. What do you mean? You knew about his connections with the competitors, he replied, standing in front of her. You warned me. And then her expression changed. She laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of humor. It was a laugh of disappointment. Yes, I knew, she said, lowering her voice. But what do you expect me to do, Martin? I've already lost everything, and now I want you to understand that. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a desperate fight for survival. And now Martin realized he was caught between two betrayals, the one committed by Bella and the one he had just uncovered about Richard. You've already made your choice, Martin said, and now I have to make mine. Martin stood before Bella, his heart pounding faster than usual. One question echoed in his mind. How would this all end? His thoughts couldn't process what he had just discovered. Bella and Richard, they were both part of a bigger scheme, and he had been nothing but a pawn. You don't really think that, do you? Bella said, rising from the couch and stepping toward him. Her voice was calm, but there was a spark in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time. Martin didn't respond. He simply stood there, trying to figure out his next move. She knew everything, and now all he could do was watch as his hopes and his relationships crumbled around him. Martin, why don't you understand? Bella continued, her voice becoming more emotional. Everything I did was for you, for our family. Richard, he's part of the game. He's always been part of it. Martin felt his breath growing heavier. It was too much to take in. What did she mean by part of the game? Part of the game? What do you mean? His voice was firm, but inside, he felt everything slipping out of control. I had a plan, Martin, Bella replied, stepping even closer. And you became part of that plan. Richard and I are working together. We're building something you could never achieve on your own. Martin struggled to comprehend. They were working together? What had she been hiding from him all this time? And what exactly is this plan? Martin couldn't hold back anymore. And why did you betray me if we were supposed to be in this together? How does it all connect? You don't understand, she said with a smile that sent a chill down Martin's spine. It was cold, calculating. This wasn't just betrayal. It was part of a strategy. Richard helped me remove you from the game, no matter how painful it was for you. He did it to keep you from interfering with what we're building. Martin slowly began to realize that everything was far more complicated than he could have imagined. Bella had walked beside him, but she'd always had different motives. His suspicions were now confirmed. She had been manipulating him all along. You mean to say you've always been part of this game with Richard? Martin asked, no longer able to believe his own ears. Exactly, she said as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I was never your wife in the way you think. We played roles. Richard and I planned all of this to get what we wanted. You were just a stepping stone. Martin felt his chest tighten, his breathing growing labored. All this time, he had believed in his family, believed in Bella. But now, it all seemed like a cheap manipulation. You used me? His voice was firm as he stood like a rock, but inside, he felt utterly betrayed. Not exactly, she said, stepping even closer to him. I was just following my path, and you happened to be part of what I was building. I never felt like I owed you anything. Martin couldn't listen to her words any longer. They wrapped around him like a venomous snake. She wasn't the person he thought she was. She was a manipulator who used everything she could for her own gain. You've been lying to me this whole time? His voice cracked with despair. This was your choice, Martin. I didn't force you to do anything. You made this decision on your own, Bella replied, her voice devoid of any emotion. Martin felt his mind beginning to unravel. What now? What should he do? He couldn't leave her, but he also couldn't leave himself trapped like this. Was this the end? Martin realized that he couldn't leave her without consequences. She had gotten everything she wanted, and now there was only one thing left for him. Find a way to turn the situation in his favor. And more importantly, he no longer trusted anyone. He couldn't just stand by and wait anymore. In the days that followed, Martin began to explore all possible options for himself. He understood that Bella and Richard had one plan, but he could use their game against them. His company was on the brink of crucial negotiations, and he knew that if this wasn't stopped now, he would lose everything. That evening, at the event Martin was hosting, he met with Richard. Looking him in the eyes, he felt his heart start to tremble. This was his chance, and he knew he couldn't afford to lose in this game. Martin stood in the dark corner of the large hall where the event was taking place. All the guests were chatting happily, but he was lost in his thoughts, the heavy burden pressing on his chest. He had just learned the whole truth about Bella and Richard. They hadn't just betrayed him. They had been manipulating him, using his every move. And now, as he kept this secret, he decided it was time to act. There was no emotion on his face. He appeared calm, but inside everything was turning. He walked up to the bar, where Richard was standing, smiling and relaxed. Martin shoved his hand into the pocket of his coat, holding the note he had just found in Bella's office. It was a clear blueprint, plans showing how she and Richard had been manipulating his finances and decisions at work. He now understood that everything had been calculated, every move, and every event in their lives had its purpose, his downfall. Richard, Martin began, his voice low, almost inaudible amidst the noise surrounding them. Richard turned his head, immediately noticing his tense expression. Martin, it's so good to see you, Richard said, his voice overly even, too confident, as if he didn't know what was coming. He extended his hand, and Martin took it, though unwillingly. Got a minute? Martin asked, not taking his eyes off Richard. Richard raised an eyebrow in surprise. Of course, there's always time for you. What's going on? Martin didn't answer. He simply tightened his grip on the note in his hand, which Richard didn't seem to notice. I know what you did, Martin said, his voice sharp and cold. Richard looked at him with indignation, silently waiting for him to continue. You and Bella? Martin couldn't take the lies anymore. You planned all of this. You used me. Richard's response was calm, which only confused Martin more. Martin, you don't understand, Richard said, acting as though he were speaking to an equal. It was all for your benefit. Bella and I are working together. It was necessary for the business. I told you that you had more opportunities than you think. Martin clenched his fists, ready to explode, but his mind was already finding new possibilities. He couldn't let Richard continue this game. Not now. For my benefit, he repeated mockingly. How dare you? You and Bella? Your so-called support group is ruining my life, and you want to tell me it's for my benefit? You've taken everything that was dear to me. Martin felt his heart beat faster. Richard began to get nervous, though he tried to hide it. His gaze became less certain. Martin, I didn't mean to. Richard fell silent for a moment, clearly taken aback by his words. It was strange because Martin couldn't recall a single time when he had seen Richard like this. But Martin wasn't going to give him any chance. He ripped the note from his pocket and unfolded it in front of Richard's eyes. Here it is, Martin pointed to the paper. Here are your plans. This is how you and Bella used me to achieve your goals. Richard glanced at the note, but didn't stop. He gave a sly smile. This isn't what you think. It's just an investment. You wouldn't have minded either if you knew what we could accomplish together, Richard said. Martin couldn't believe his ears. He decided he wouldn't stay silent any longer. No, Richard, this isn't an investment. It's betrayal, and you'll pay for it. Richard took a step back, but his confidence was already fading. This was what Martin had been aiming for. He had made him nervous. That was the power. You're already in a trap, Richard, Martin said, shoving the note back into his pocket. What do you want to do? Richard asked, though his voice was no longer as cheerful. All you need to know is that we're no longer on the same side, Martin said with a firm expression on his face. At that moment, Bella approached them. She seemed calm, but her eyes betrayed her anxiety. What happened? She asked, looking from Martin to Richard. Martin lifted his gaze and stared directly into her eyes. She understood. She knew her secrets were out. You've already explained everything to me, Bella, he said, and her heart likely sank. And now, when Richard and I sort things out, I'll be watching your next steps more closely. She stood silently, feeling trapped. She no longer had the control she once had. Martin stepped back, leaving them both in the shadow of his manipulations. He knew this was just the beginning of the game. Now, he was at the point where he had to decide what to do next. Martin stepped out into the street, his mind swirling with thoughts. The previous day had left its mark on his soul. He felt a certain relief after exposing the truth about Bella and Richard, but the inner emptiness remained. He wasn't ready for what all of this had led to. He wasn't ready for what he had truly lost. And then, the next day, while he was still reflecting on everything, his friend invited him to meet at a local cafe. At that moment, Martin wasn't thinking about what might happen. He wasn't expecting to find someone who would make him feel any emotion. And that's when she appeared. The girl was sitting in the corner of the cafe, reading a book and drinking coffee. Her dark hair fell over her shoulders, and her eyes, absorbed in the text, met his gaze. Martin couldn't look away. She was so calm, while he was in despair. He didn't know her and had no intention of starting a new relationship, but something in her gaze made him approach. Hi, he said with a smile, not entirely sure of his words. She looked up and smiled in return. Hi, how are you? Her voice was soft, and there was something familiar in it. He felt his heart beat faster. She looked carefree, but she was the kind of woman who could make him turn a new page in life. I'm good, he replied, not wanting to appear too emotional. I'm Martin. I'm Sophia, she said, extending her hand to him. They shook hands, and Martin felt a slight electric pulse that made him a bit nervous. She seemed self-sufficient, but at the same time, vulnerable. What are you reading? He asked, trying to find something to talk about. Classical literature, Sophia answered, smiling. It's a book about self-awareness. Interesting, Martin said. I'm also looking for myself right now. And it was true. He had been trying to find his way in life after everything fell apart with Bella. He was no longer the same man he once was. So this conversation with Sophia became exactly what he had needed for so long. With every passing minute, they talked more and more. Sophia didn't get distracted by her phone or anything else. She simply listened and answered his questions. Martin felt how, with every word, he started to forget everything that had happened with Bella and Richard. For several days, they met, and each time, the connection between them grew stronger. Martin began to feel better, his mind no longer cluttered with thoughts of betrayal. Sophia seemed perfect, and he could no longer imagine his life without her presence. But one day, the following week, after returning home from another meeting with Sophia, his attention was caught by a phone call from Bella. He didn't answer it right away, but later, when his thoughts of Sophia had faded, he dialed Bella's number again. "Hi," he said, his voice calm but at the same time cold. "Martin, I know you're interested in someone else," Bella started, her voice a bit higher. "But I want to talk to you about what happened between us." Martin felt his heart tighten. She could manipulate him, but he was no longer the kind of man who could just be brought back to her will. "Bella, it's over," he replied, trying not to give in to her tricks. "There's nothing between us. You ruined everything." But she didn't give up. "Martin, you still don't understand." Her voice was calm but held a hint of deceit. "You can't just forget about us. You know I still love you. And this girl, Sophia, she's just temporary for you. I know how you feel. And you know there were moments between us that you won't find with anyone else." Martin felt something break inside of him again, but he was no longer the same. He didn't want to fall into her trap. "This isn't your decision, Bella," he said firmly. "My life, my feelings are no longer yours. I've made my choice." The phone line went dead, but Martin knew this wasn't the end. Bella would manipulate him until the very last moment, and she had probably already found out about Sophia. The next day, Sophia texted him again, saying she wanted to meet. Martin decided that he would no longer allow anyone to control his life. Bella was in the past, and before him was a new opportunity. But would he be able to keep this connection with Sophia if Bella continued to manipulate him? Martin stood at the threshold of his apartment, looking at the door that led into his past. He knew his decisions could change everything, but his heart didn't give in, and his mind couldn't accept it. All those years spent with Bella seemed to leave invisible threads in his soul, threads that were hard to cut. He was the man who wanted to move forward, but couldn't forget her eyes, her touch, her words. Just yesterday, he had been with Sophia. She was something new, something that brought peace. But when he returned home, his heart could no longer calm down. It felt like emptiness, the kind that appeared after learning of betrayal. Nothing had changed in the apartment where they had laughed together, planned the future. But today, everything looked foreign and unfamiliar. Martin felt his anger rising, but at the same time, love. He remembered the moments when Bella sat beside him, when they walked in the park together, when he dreamed of a future with her. He still loved her, despite what she had done. He opened the door and saw her. Bella was sitting on the couch, resting her head on her hand. Her face looked tired, and her eyes were slightly red from crying. But there was something more in this. She looked so vulnerable, as if she was ready to give everything to get him back. And it didn't even seem insincere. "Martin," her voice was soft, but there was something profoundly complex in it. "I know I betrayed you. I understand that you won't forgive me, but please, don't leave. I realize everything now, everything." Martin stood there, looking at her, unsure of what to say. Words couldn't express what he felt. The betrayal was obvious, but his heart couldn't seem to let her go. He understood that she might have her version of events, but could they still build something after what had happened? "Do you want me to stay?" he finally asked, trying to maintain his calm. Bella lifted her gaze, and in her eyes was something that made his heart tighten. She stood before him, anxious, but unsure of how to apologize. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake, and I want to fix everything, Martin. I can't live knowing you're suffering because of me." Martin felt confused. He saw her tears, but deep inside, he felt that this might just be a performance to provoke sympathy. He heard her words, but he couldn't believe she would change. But just as she raised her hand and showed him something he never expected to see, on her finger was a new ring. Martin didn't immediately understand what this meant, but then, that that small detail, felt like a slap in the face. It was the same ring she had shown him once when they were planning their wedding, and now it meant something entirely different. "You're with him again, aren't you?" Martin asked, his voice now carrying a different tone. Bella lowered her head. Her eyes began to glisten, but this wasn't genuine despair anymore. It was more like an excuse, a last attempt to salvage something. I didn't know what to do," she said with a trembling voice. "He's no longer with your brother and I wanted to step back, but I couldn't, Martin." Everything seemed so confusing. Martin stood there, as if frozen. He could no longer listen to these excuses. He had no strength to hear her justify what he had already witnessed. He knew it was just manipulation, a way to get him back. It was hard for him to believe her words. "I saw it," he said, not looking up. "I saw you with him, how you went to him, how you spent time together. I saw it all with my own eyes, Bella." She fell silent, but in her eyes, it was clear that she had no response left. She couldn't convince him, couldn't elicit sympathy from him. Martin felt the weight of every movement in his soul. He loved her, even after seeing everything. It was like a great canvas he had watched with admiration, but now it was torn and ripped apart. "It's hard to leave you," he whispered. "You're still a part of me, but I can't keep suffering because of your decisions." She moved toward him, trying to stop him, but he stepped back. "No, don't," he replied. "I love you, but I can't live like this anymore." He turned and walked away, leaving her in the same emptiness she had created in his life. He felt empty, but at the same time, free. Free from the lies. Martin stood at the threshold, his heart beating in his chest, and his mind couldn't make the decision. She stood just a few steps away, trying to hold on to him, but he felt his soul slowly drifting away from the situation, from these emotions. His legs didn't want to move, but he had already taken that step. The cold parquet beneath his feet echoed, and with it, Bella seemed to drift away as well, like a bright flash from his past. But it was at that moment that he heard the sound of a phone vibrating on the table. Martin couldn't resist and turned around. It was strange, but something about this call made him lift his gaze. On the screen, Sophia's name appeared. No one knew what was going through his head at that moment. All the moments with Bella, which he had already lived through, seemed to have pushed him forward. Sophia was a new beginning, and although his heart still struggled to let go of the past, she was his chance. Martin pressed the answer button. "Martin, hey?" Sophia's voice was clear and calm, with an extraordinary confidence that Martin himself lacked. "How are you?" He didn't answer immediately, just sighed and glanced at the door where Bella was standing. She was looking at him, her gaze full of despair, but Martin felt himself distancing from her world. And yet, deep in his heart, there was a void. "I'm fine, Sophia. How are you?" Martin had to say, feeling his voice steadying. "Martin, you can't disappear like that. I need you. Do you remember what we talked about? How we'd always stay in touch?" Sophia's voice carried a hint of concern. Her words were tender, and Martin felt his hands trembling as he listened to her. This was his chance for a new life, but was he ready? He looked at Bella again. There were probably many tears and regret in her eyes, but he could no longer allow her to manipulate him again. "Sophia, I'm with you," he said and put the phone on the table. And in that very moment, a thought crossed his mind that made him change his behavior. If he made the choice now and went to Sophia, would it repeat with Bella? After all, she was a part of his life, and it wasn't easy to turn his back on her. Martin lifted his head when he heard quiet footsteps behind him. Bella had approached, and this moment felt like a moment between two worlds. He saw her again, not the way he first saw her. Her gaze wasn't just filled with regret, it was full of true despair. "Martin," she whispered as she came closer, "I understand that I made you happy, and then I destroyed it. I don't have the right to ask you to stay, but you're all I have." Martin sighed, and it seemed like all the emotions overwhelmed him at once. He raised his head and looked at her. Bella looked as if she had lost all her strength. This wasn't just a game. It was real pain. "Do you want me to stay?" he finally asked, but the words sounded nothing like he wanted. It was more a question to himself than to her. "Yes, I have no right to ask, but I love you, Martin. I promise I will do everything to change, to fix everything. I understand now, and I won't make this mistake again. Martin felt his heart thaw a little. This was the moment that could change everything. But he still didn't know what to do. Martin couldn't find the words to explain everything. He sat still, and every inch of his body protested against what he felt. He loved her. But was this love real? Or was it just a desire to get back what he had, even if it was an illusion? But everything changed when Bella approached the table and picked up his phone. Martin glanced at her hands, and suddenly something unexpected sparked in his mind. She was checking something. She opened a message. Sophia. Bella looked at him in surprise, and with ruthless determination, she stood before him and said, "You haven't broken up with her yet, have you? You're still trying to keep her in your life?" Martin didn't have time to respond when Bella suddenly raised her eyes and whispered, "You know why I'm doing this, don't you? Because I know that this is not just betrayal on my part. This is your weakness." Her words hit him like a blow. Bella slammed the phone onto the table and, looking him in the eyes, said, "You've always been her shadow, Martin. And you want me to leave? You want to leave everything for her, just because you're too weak to find yourself alone?" Her words cut through his heart like knives. He felt anger mixing with pain. He realized her manipulations were stronger than he had ever imagined. Now he stood on the edge, and every choice was becoming final. Would he continue to believe her words and stay? Or would he take the same path that would lead him to a new destiny? Martin stood in the room, his heart pounding wildly. He tried to remain calm, but everything inside him was torn. Bella, who had only moments ago been in harmony with him, was now becoming more and more foreign. And that was the worst part. He saw how she manipulated him, how she was once again trying to keep him hooked. But right now, on the verge of a decision, Martin felt that everything was going wrong. "You can trust me, Martin," she whispered again, her voice filled with despair. "I've changed. I know I made you unhappy, but if you give me a chance." Martin sighed and, without looking at her, checked his phone. The message from Sophia appeared on the screen again, and this time, he felt it like a blow. Bella understood everything. Her eyes quickly stopped on his phone, and there was aggression in her gaze. "Is that her? The one you want to be with?" she asked, not hiding her anger. Martin remained silent. He couldn't say anything that would justify his actions. She had seen everything, and even if he wanted to, he couldn't explain his attraction to Sophia. She was like fresh air, compared to Bella, with whom he had endured so much pain and manipulation. But even that wasn't helping him make a final decision. "Bella, Martin began, but she interrupted him. "Don't," she said sharply. "You've already made your choice. Is this what you want? To leave me for someone else?" Martin walked to the window and looked at the evening city, shining with thousands of lights. It seemed that every light was a part of his emotions. Did he really want to leave Bella? She, though she had betrayed him, was still a part of his life. And even though he didn't love her the way he used to, she was his habit, his light in the dark. Maybe he wasn't ready to leave it behind just yet. But at that moment, when he felt pain and disappointment tearing at his heart more and more, his gaze fell on a letter on the table. It was the letter Bella had left him a few days ago. She wrote it when everything between them was still good. She spoke to him with an openness that now seemed like just another manipulative gesture. He picked up the letter and began reading. "Martin, I know that you're always by my side, and you deserve happiness. I want you to find yourself, so we can build our life together. But I can't hold you back if you no longer love me. I know I made a mistake, and if you ever see me differently than I was, forgive me. It's very hard for me, but I want you to be happy." Each word hurt him even more. Bella hadn't just betrayed him. She was giving him freedom, but behind that freedom were many doubts and unanswered questions. She wasn't capable of fully opening up, and he felt it. Martin understood that he couldn't stay in a relationship where there was no trust. But then something unexpected happened. Sophia, on the other end of the phone, finally said something that made his heart stop. "Martin, there's something I need to tell you." Her voice sounded serious, even a little worried. "What happened?" he asked, feeling his heart race. This isn't about us," she began. "But I need you to understand. There's something I should have told you earlier." Martin tensed. His intuition told him that something important was about to happen. "And what is it?" he asked, holding the phone closer to him. "Do you know who Daniel is, right? The guy you met on the forum last week?" Sophia asked, her voice now even more serious. Martin froze. He remembered Daniel. He was the same guy that Bella had probably spent more time with during those events between them. "Yes, I remember," Martin said, feeling the anxiety rise in his chest again. "Martin, I've learned something very important, and if you truly want to understand why your wife behaves the way she does, it's because she's been involved with him for a long time." Martin felt a chill run through his body. This was not just betrayal. It was the crossing of all the boundaries he had tried to uphold. Bella had gone too far, and now this was not just a feeling. It was the reality he had to accept. He felt everything in his heart turn upside down. Sophia was telling the truth. But what now? How would this change his future? Martin clenched his fists. Now he had to decide whether to stay and look into the eyes of the person who deceived him, or to choose the path that would lead him to something new, free from lies. Martin stood at the threshold of the house, feeling every step bring him closer to a decision that would change everything. His soul was torn between two women. On one side, Bella, whom he loved, but who betrayed him. On the other side, Sophia, who, though not as emotionally connected as he had been with Bella, was honest, real, and he felt her support was what he needed right now. When he returned home after his conversation with Sophia, he felt the mixture of disappointment and pain knotting in his heart. Bella met his gaze, filled with fear and anxiety. Her eyes were red from crying, but he felt no sympathy. He was overwhelmed with emotions, and in that moment, his desire for revenge turned into a need to release everything that had built up over the past weeks. "Martin, I know you found out everything," Bella said, her voice trembling, "and I understand why you would do this. I was a fool, but I will change, I promise." Martin looked at her, and there was not a shred of mercy in his heart. Now that he knew the whole truth, he couldn't allow himself to let everything remain as it was. He didn't want to be with someone who had not been honest with him. He didn't want to stay in toxic relationships. "And why did you do all of this?" he asked, his voice cold as ice. "You haven't been my wife for a long time. And this isn't just betrayal, Bella. It was torture." Her face turned pale, but she didn't look away. "I don't know why. I was weak. I wanted more than I could get, and I forgot why I was with you in the first place. I didn't want to lose you, but I still did." Martin held his breath. He felt in his pocket the piece of paper Sophia had left him. She wrote that everything he'd experienced with Bella was just a reflection of his fears. She emphasized that now he had to make a choice and that it was time to move forward. However, she also warned him that every decision he made would leave scars on him. She was right, but those scars were already on his heart. "You want me to come back, don't you?" he asked, and irony crept into his voice. "But what will I have in return? More lies? More pain? More betrayals?" Bella cried again, but Martin felt his emotions becoming more and more detached. "Martin, I can't live without you. I was wrong. I promise it won't happen again." She squeezed his hand, trying to find any small proof that something could still change. But Martin felt that this hand was no longer his support. He had seen too many lies to continue believing in her words. His heart couldn't keep itself in this, even if it was hard. "I'm sorry, Bella, but I can't be with you anymore," he said softly, with great pain in his heart. "I need to move on." Martin ripped his hand away and walked toward the door. In that moment, he felt how important it was to find his true freedom. He was walking away from Bella, who was turning back to her old mistakes, but this time he couldn't follow in her footsteps. He called Sophia. The voice on the other end of the line sounded calm again, but there was something new in it. Maybe it was fear, maybe hope, but it was what he had been looking for. "Sophia, I've made my decision," he said, not giving himself a chance to second-guess. "And what is it?" she asked, her voice sounding interested but with a note of patience. "I'm staying with you." Martin felt immediate relief wash over him. Sophia was silent for a few seconds before speaking. "That was very brave of you. I don't know if you're doing it for the right reasons, but I'm ready to support you, Martin." His heart calmed slightly. He didn't feel confident, but he didn't need to feel confident right now. He was looking for peace, not the perfect answer. And though he wasn't ready to say this was love, he felt that he wanted to walk this path with her. Martin returned home and, casting a glance at the empty room where not long ago he and Bella had dreamed of a future together, he finally took a step toward a new chapter. This wasn't just a choice between two women. It was a choice between the past and the future, between what he had already lived and what he still had to live. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. The pain was still there, but it was the pain of growth, of accepting that he had a right to happiness. And this time, he didn't want to lose himself. Leaving Bella behind, he felt how this decisive step gave him strength. With Sophia ahead, he found it hard to imagine how their relationship would evolve. But in that moment, Martin felt only one thing. He chose freedom. He chose himself. And that was the only right decision. Should Martin leave his betrayed wife Bella and give a chance to a new relationship with Sophia, or did he make a mistake by not trying to forgive and trust Bella again? Share your thoughts.